Okay, so people are trickling in, but maybe I'll just go ahead and get started. Well, welcome everyone. I'm Paige Ruane. I'm a co-founder of Partners for Climate Action, and we will be facilitating this morning coffee. I will be facilitating this morning coffee series session. At PCA, we work to foster meaningful ecological climate action within the bioregion of the Hudson River Estuary watershed. And for those of you who aren't familiar with the concept of a bioregion, it's an area defined by the characteristics of the natural environment instead of rather than human-made boundaries like municipal or county boundaries. Our work here at PCA is done through grant making, technical support to nonprofits and municipalities, programs, and educational offerings like today. And this is all made possible by donations, so we encourage you to contribute if you can. So here's a couple logistics. This session is being recorded and will be shared with all of you and posted on our website. And we ask that you please mute yourselves, but feel free to submit comments and questions in the chat. And if you follow the chat and like questions you want to hear answered by using the thumbs up button next to the question, we will prioritize those likes. All right, so our topic today is building community through consensus. So PCA's work, as many of you know, is locally focused. We believe that the overlapping ecological crises are best addressed by the communities that are closest to them. And we share that in common with today's guests, Jocelyn Apicello and her partner, Jason Angell. Jocelyn and Jason are the co-founders and co-directors of Ecological Citizens Project, a nonprofit based in the Hudson Valley that works to grow citizen-led campaigns to produce a more just, healthy, and democratic, sustainable way of life. Jocelyn serves on the town board of Phillipstown, New York, and is a member of PCA's advisory board. Jocelyn is a professor of public health and sits on the boards of the Cold Spring Farmers Market and the local school district. Together, they own and operate and live on Long Hall Farm in Garrison, New York, with their 2 children, where they run a CSA. And this is just the half of it. They are behind many other cutting-edge projects in the Hudson Valley, so thankfully we will have them back for another session to cover more territory. So I have really been struck by their creativity and the power of their work for a long time now. They are systemic thinkers who have thought deeply about the roots of the multiple and interconnected crises that we face. Their work and the way they live their lives, which they see as inextricable, provide potent examples of how to avoid the pitfalls of prescribed solutions. And today, they're going to walk us through a process they designed that empowered their own community to work together, giving everyone a voice and catalyzing profound action and community strength. The community Congress process that they will describe was a huge part of the inspiration for PCA's new training grant program, Funding Futures, which will lead 6 Hudson Valley communities to conduct listening campaigns in order to find consensus on and funding for their environmental priorities. So I am thrilled to welcome you both today. Without further ado, Jason and Jocelyn, thank you for being here, and please take it away.
Thank you so much, Paige, for that very, very nice intro.
You're welcome.
So happy to be here.
Yeah, good morning, everybody. I hope we were just saying that since it's the coffee series, I hope everybody's had their coffee. We expect the intelligence to slowly creep up as the caffeine kicks in throughout the morning. But and it's really nice to see a bunch of faces that are friends and people's names who I recognize from work throughout the Hudson Valley who are all involved in their own communities. So we're really happy to come and talk to you today. And also very happy about the work Partners for Climate Action does. I sit on their advisory board and specifically kind of their new work in this Funding Futures program, which feels like it's very kind of pertinent around the time we're in. So we're really happy to share the Community Congress model with you and just kind of hear thoughts and talk throughout the day. And Jocelyn, before I was going to get going, I just wanted to give a little context before we got into the details of the community Congress model. And part of that would just be a little bit of the context around the thinking that led up to that community Congress model. And for me personally, who had spent most of my life before moving to the Hudson Valley and farming and starting the Ecological Citizens Project, all with Jocelyn. And we're married, by the way, so if you notice a dynamic going on throughout the presentation, that's what explains it. But so I think a little bit of the context is I had spent most of my previous life working in politics and policy change at different geographic levels, and both as the kind of leading a think tank for the Working Families Party and then working on multiple political campaigns. And I think part of the context, as we'll get into, is and it feels a little eerie that we're still in that context, is one that with our dominant political system, we're living in times where kind of we've created a civic environment of conflict. Where really it's about which party's in power, and so that civic area of conflict makes it difficult to talk about important community issues without feeling the baggage of that energy. And the community Congress kind of tries to deal with that a little bit. But we're also, for many of us, I mean, I recognize many faces working on policy and policy change, that that kind of swinging back and forth between parties and extremes and conflict makes it very hard to create an environment of sustainability for sustained policy progress, probably on a lot of the issues we all care about, these kind of boom and bust cycles. So also part of the thinking is, how do we create more sustainable policy work without back and forth? And then the third is just kind of in the background of all of this, what we're going to talk about is, what is the role of the citizen? As all of us kind of know the magnitude of problems we're facing, do we have more of a role than just being a good citizen and voting every 2 or 4 years? What does the role look beyond that? So, Jocelyn, I just kind of wanted to mention that before we get in, because I think these are all things that probably are still relevant right now for this moment.
Definitely. Thank you. Yeah. Do you think, well, so we're going to walk you through we kind of boiled it down to 5 basic steps of the Community Congress. And we'll walk you through just with a series of maybe photos and stuff through a slideshow. But just to prep you, the 5 basic steps were like, 1, get your community together in real life, in person. I know that's hard to do, and we do it less and less, and so we got to bring it back to our communities. The second step is pretty much all about communication and promotion. How do you communicate with people who bring ideas forward? How do you promote events that you're going to do, and the upcoming votes and actions? The third step is to assess the consensus of your community by carrying out this community-wide vote, which we'll explain. The fourth step is to report back to the community, right? Produce something that can be shared and that provides kind of valid, reliable methods, and kind of inspires people to do step 5, which is to take action, right? How do you collect names, emails, phone numbers, whatever it may be, of potential volunteers who actually care about the issues that are voted on? And how do you kind of sustain, or, I mean, maybe institutionalize, but really sustain people's action through the community as a result of this process. And this process, took us about a year for the 2 communities we did it in, which is Phillipstown and the city of Peekskill in Westchester County. And we'll tell you all about it. I'm going to start the slideshow if we don't mind.
And as you're starting, Jocelyn, I'll just say that some of the background of this is also kind of other participatory democracy efforts, such as participatory budgeting programs in New York City, participatory budgeting programs in Hartford. And so, some of the thinking here is kind of how we think about representative democracy. Our role is to vote for a representative, and they're the ones who define the agenda and make decisions, versus more direct democratic action where people are in the positions of defining the agenda and taking the action. But, a lot of this emerged also from other work happening in the field of participatory democracy that inspired us.
Okay, so I hope you can all see the screen. Just very briefly, our first community Congress. Look at how long ago this graphic is. It's so different. How much graphic design has changed in almost a decade. We came together in the town of Phillipstown. It happened to be the weekend after, the 2016 election, where a lot of partisanship had struck and was fierce, and we wanted to get people together in our space, in person, to just talk about how to have an open, respectful, forward-thinking dialogue, right, about how we can create change at the local level. We actually set up a board and with Post-its, and we said, write every maybe like kind of negative or scary or divisive thought in your mind and your soul right now, write it down and just leave it on the board, and then come into the space trying to be free from that, and let's try to think about how we can actually work together. So we gathered folks together on the farm. We had, I don't know, over 100 people coming throughout the day, and that led us, Jason and I, to a group of volunteers who wanted to really work together on this concept of the community Congress. And together with these very dedicated volunteers, Priscilla Goldfarb and Jane Marcy, we executed the whole thing. And one thing which I'll say early on is, as a nonprofit, we went to a concerned neighbor who was very interested in this process, and he said, what do you need to carry out this vision of a community Congress for the town of Phillipstown? And we told him $10,000. That's what we assumed at that point. And so he really helped to sponsor the initiative. And we're really grateful that PCA is really elevating the model by making funding a part of what community Congress type actions can be, because it's helpful. Because as we'll roll into this now, the first step of our community Congress was get your community together in person, as much as possible in real life. So I am just showing a screenshot of our first flyer that we sent out, that we posted in newspapers, and we posted in local libraries and supermarkets, and we emailed around to all of the folks on our list, telling people about what our community Congress initiative was. Again, we are farmers and we are nonprofit folks and not necessarily graphic designers. It's a little wordy, but this is kind of how we started sharing the idea. So something that was very important to Jason and I when we gathered the community together in person was food and fun and socializing mixed in with the civics action. So we held 3 gatherings that were, I'll let Jason talk about how we chose the spaces and the diversity of the spaces, but around the towns that we were in, and they were half programming and half socializing. And we supported local businesses. We had a lot of food, we had a lot of drink, and we had music, and we had childcare. And one thing we also had later on, especially when we moved into Peekskill, we had translation services available at the events, because there's a large Spanish-speaking population in the city of Peekskill. So we solicited this through this question, which is in red, the second in red. What do you think should be our top priorities to preserve and promote a strong community? And we solicited this question across the town, and we got folks to write back and give us their ideas. And in both towns that we did it in, we got around 40 different proposals. And then we split them up across the three different gatherings that we had. So 2 quick things. So here is an example of our Peekskill flyer that was sent out, where we actually work with an amazing graphic designer for this one, and her name's Jen Giatinta. And we also had everything translated into the Spanish for our Peekskill Community Congress. But I'm showing this next slide just to show, blacking out some personal information, personal identifying information, but showing that Jason and I worked so hard to get a diversity of voices and people and viewpoints in the room. And that meant breaking down barriers, at the literally political parties, at the Democratic committee that was local and the Republican committee and the conservative committees locally, but also going to every civic engagement group we could possibly imagine. And reaching out also to local businesses and to active, engaged residents of the towns, the faith-based community. So you can see that there was a diversity of people that we tried to reach out to. Jason, I wonder if you want to tell a little bit about some of the places we selected, or who we got involved, and why it's so important, why it was so critical to us to really make sure we weren't just seen as like the hippie farmers who wanted to get people together to socialize and promote ideas, but really like take seriously that this is a civic engagement exercise, and we need the diversity of voices there.
Thanks, Joss. Yeah, I'll say a few things. I mean, before we go a little bit further. So one, I think one thing I reflect on is that, that citizen soapbox, which was the first step to the community congress, that happened very quickly. That was a week after the November 2016 election. And I don't know if you all remember, regardless of talking about, which party won that election, but there was a palpable feeling in communities of what can we do right now? And so I think putting out an email and getting 100 people in response means that you are, there's a lot of people feeling that same feeling. A second thing I reflect on is how uninstitutionalized it was at the beginning. You can see from this picture, it's kind of a gathering in a backyard. There's kids running around. There really was the things that were being reiterated, and that it kind of stayed true throughout the community congress. And we kind of gravitated from that name Citizen Soapbox, which is just creating a platform for anybody who lives in a community to speak, to the idea of community congress being it is the community in control of the agenda. But throughout and Jocelyn, you can go for it. I mean, I don't need slides. Throughout, one thing that defined the feeling of these public forums, and we did 3 or 4 in each place, one in the town of Phillipstown, which is our town, and then 3 or 4 in the city of Peekskill, is Jocelyn mentioned this, but like they felt fun because in the sense, like the residents that are making proposals only had 3 minutes. And so the feel of that forum is kind of like, it's almost like America's Got Talent versus direct democracy. It was like, okay, here's my 3-minute pitch in answer to a common question. And that common question was purposely very open-ended. What would be your top priority to preserve and promote a strong community? And so you got these quick pitches, right? And then half of the event is people listening to these quick pitches, and you do need someone with fortitude to mind the clock and cut people off. And then you go into half of just social time, food, drink, people talking about the ideas proposed. And so that kind of formed the basis. And I'll just kind of, Jocelyn mentioned, as an example, our town that we live in, the town of Phillipstown, most people would say, it's, that often it votes at the representative level for Democratic candidates, but at the same time, it's gone purple. Within the town of Phillipstown, you have smaller hamlets, Cold Spring, Continental Village, and those all have their own particular kind of flavors. And so as we were even kind of deciding where these public forums would be held, we really wanted a diversity of geographic location and place in order to make different groups of people feel comfortable. So this picture is a picture of local St. Philip's Church in Phillipstown. We also did a forum at the Garrison Fish and Game Club. And so, just a very quick anecdote there. And we did that purposefully because the Garrison Fish and Game Club is a hunting and fishing and wildlife club. Most people associate it with more of, I guess, a right-leaning group of people, if you can say that. And so when we went in to talk to the board of directors early on in this process to allow them to use the forum, I came into the Garrison Fish and Game Club, and there were 4 or 5 men wearing, really like they looked like they'd stepped out of the woods from hunting. And they're sitting around kind of a little questionable about what this community congress process is. It's the afternoon, everybody's kind of drinking beers. I sit down, no one offers me a beer for the first 30 minutes we're talking. Okay, all right. And they're kind of very questionable. What's the agenda of this process? What are you trying to get at here? And it took a while for us to convince them there is no agenda. This is a platform. And so if anybody has an idea about what would make our community better, this is creating a platform for it. So, it's kind of open question if they'll let us use Garrison Fish and Game Club, and I get up to go. And one of the guys stops and says, as I'm leaving, you know what? I've always thought a lot about what Phillipstown needs to make it a better community. And I was like, oh, what's that? What would be your priority? He's like, more biking paths. And I was like, that's really funny, because I just came from a climate smart group and they just said the same thing. So anyway, like, we found throughout this process that there is a real sense of power in going to different community organizations without a set agenda and creating a platform, because it helps pull community organizations in. And Jocelyn, I'll just end by going to that list that you showed, because I want to make one point for those who think about organizing an effort like this. Like Jocelyn said, we just did an analysis of all the kind of community-based organizations in each community and then did outreach to them. But one of the most powerful tools of outreach we had is that when we talked to, for example, here, the chair of the Conservation Advisory Council in Peekskill, or the Peekskill NAACP, what they quickly realized is all of us who work in grassroots nonprofits and we go and we try to get other groups to help promote the work we're doing, everybody's strapped. Everybody's trying to promote their own work, as they should. This created a platform by which groups could promote their own priorities. And that allowed them to do the outreach for us, because in doing that, they were helping building an audience for their own work. And that just became a very critical organizing tool and effort. So I'll leave it there, Jocelyn, unless there's anything else we want to say at that point.
I just wanted to give a couple more ways that we did outreach, because you have to get out of in front of your computer screen. I think it's really the best way to connect with folks. So we actually flyered, Jason and I, at train stations or in front of, like I said earlier, supermarkets. We went to libraries. We knocked on some doors. I mean, we did a lot of outreach to encourage the diversity of people and viewpoints that we could get into the room. We hung up posters. We did some screen-based work. We wrote press releases. We did social media campaigns. Actually, this one right here, it was just like a Facebook ad that we had put on for the Peekskill. It was an Instagram ad, just so people could learn about one of the upcoming forums. We used phone calls and texts to remind people of the forums, and then later on to remind people of the vote. And we did presentations, like Jason mentioned, to many different groups in both of the towns we did it in front of their boards of directors, or just in front of their regular membership meetings, to promote the initiative as much as we possibly could. There is one more video here. Oh, how do I, there. Jason, do you want to try to show this one at this point?
Yeah, I think this will give folks a sense. So this is, again, in the city of Peekskill, which was our second community congress. This was a forum that was occurring at the Peekskill Brewery. And so what you'll just see, and throughout the process, we were making local media aware of the process. And I think local media was interested, because you didn't really know what was going to come out of a forum, because you had residents proposing different things. And so I do think it's good to reach out to local media, people who are blogging, and make them aware. But this will give you a little sense of the feel of a forum.
Okay, pardon my techno skills, but you can see this low HUD video screen all? Yeah, okay, great. I will press play and
best ideas to move Peekskill forward. And then we're going to find out what people care about the most in common with the citywide vote on the priorities that Peekskill residents are proposing. And it's a way to concentrate on how to move the whole community forward together. The idea really is it's a 21st century way of doing democracy. And the main idea is that people living in a community should have a way to put forward their best ideas to move the community forward. And that's what you're going to see tonight. Here to talk about a fundamental issue right here in downtown Peekskill. How many of you, show of hands, have used the crosswalk to get to this brewery tonight? False, there is none. There's no crosswalks here.
Sidewalks and traffic, energy investments, trees, litter, power outages. How do we address those?
If we want to look back at this time and measure it as a real success, I feel we must take care of those not yet old enough to advocate for themselves. And with that being said, I'm trying to teach them tonight how to advocate for themselves.
In the city of Peekskill, diversity in its many manifestations, race, class, culture, to name a few, it's part of what makes our city a dynamic, rich, and interesting place to live and visit. However, when you look at our civic institutions, houses of worship, recreational centers, restaurants, coffee houses, most are segregated.
I'm asking your support for as a priority issue, immigration inclusion. I feel that extending support to the Latino community is both a moral imperative as well as a practical common sense action that will benefit the entire town.
I'll make one note here. Like, it's ridiculous for all of us who organize community events and know that isn't one of the most important thing offering food. I mean, if you can offer food and drink and gathering, that's important, especially in these times. So
agreed. Okay, so we kept up the press coverage as much as we could, getting people to learn about the forums where the presenters or proposers stood up in front of their crowds. You saw many examples in that video from Low HUD, proposing in 3 minutes what they thought would build a stronger and more resilient community. And when we completed those series of forums, it was time to reach consensus. So the next step was to create a community vote. So this is an example of a trifold mailer that was sent out. There's one side, there's this side. You can see on the left, this is your ballot. This was our Phillipstown ballot. We mailed trifold ballots to every household in Phillipstown, and then when we did it in Peekskill, to all households in Peekskill using an everyday direct mail function of the USPS. So it's just kind of does pre-sorted mail and delivers to everybody. So we know that every household in the towns received the ballots. You can see on this left side that the paper ballot allowed for 2 household members to vote on their top 3 priorities. So we did ranked choice voting. Well, not ranked choice voting. We just allowed them to rank their top 3. And you can see here on this back side of it, in Phillipstown, we had 40 separate proposals. And we had to boil those 3-minute presentations down to a 2 to 3 word title and a 12-word kind of quick snippet of what these proposals were. So 2 people were allowed to vote by postal mail. They could drop these ballots at locations around the cities or towns. There was also an online ability to vote. We used a Google form back then. There's many other ways to do online voting. So that allowed more household members, because obviously if you had the 2, say, adult household members, and we were allowing, as you can see here at the top of the ballot, all residents 13 and older were eligible to vote, because we wanted the youth to feel like they were part of this process. And we also had these paper ballots in various locations around the towns and city. And in Peekskill especially, we really elevated the game and made a bit more of an effort to be inside the schools. as Jason had mentioned. So we also had ballot boxes in the schools where people could drop their responses. Jay, anything you want to add?
Yeah, I'll just add on if you're looking at the page you were just on,
This one? Yeah.
if you look at the bottom below people's priorities, there's a box that people could check that says, I'd like to learn more about how to help work on proposals I voted for, optional. And then it gave them the option to give their personal contact information. The reason we included that is because we wanted this to be more than just a agenda setting process. We wanted it to be a civic volunteer-driven process. And so that was to allow people to connect with the proposals they voted for. And so we'll see in the report back, we were surprised by how many people checked that box and gave their personal email or phone number to basically create a volunteer mobilization list after the vote.
Thanks, Jay. So I want to just also quickly say that while this did expand the voter pool, right? Because it was anyone, you didn't have to be registered. Plus, it included 13 to 17-year-olds in the municipalities. But as an example, in Peekskill, we had about 1,500 ballots returned, and I'll talk about the methodology and data cleaning briefly in a second. But that represented 40% of the voter turnout in Peekskill for the most recent, at that time, general election. So this tiny community initiative got a fair turnout. In Phillipstown, that was a 27% of the voter turnout in Phillipstown. And like I said, that's an expanded age bracket, and anyone was able to vote. But we were happy to have reached the number of people we reached.
And
okay,
yeah, we should go to the report back, like you're going to the results, and talk a little bit about the impact that flowed from this process.
Yeah, so once we'll get to quickly, once you collect all the data, you got to have someone available who has been trained in some kind of survey methodology, if possible, to just do some data cleaning and some analysis. And so we did that. I do that for my professional world in the field of public health, do survey methodology. So we had a lot of data checks, ways that we wanted to verify, for example, that the people who actually submitted ballots were residents of the town. So people were required to provide name and address and verifying information. We actually I randomly called 50 people who replied to just kind of see, oh, okay, and who had provided their personal phone numbers, just to say, is it verified that there's this many people in your household, right? Because they had 3 people from the household. We removed duplicates, and we did a lot of data cleaning to try to verify that there was valid ballots coming in. We also had a third-party person kind of review the data and the methods following the analysis, just to have one extra check to make sure that it wasn't like there were ballots being stuffed for a particular priority, so to say. I'll get quickly now to this vote report. We published a report. We had a press release for it. We put it on the websites. We shared it with all of the partners who we had worked with throughout the process. We printed it out and handed it to libraries and et cetera, so that everyone could have access to it. And the report was short, right? Because there wasn't much data that we were collecting besides what are your top 3 priorities. We also reported back on, age breakdowns. You can see that in Peekskill, almost half of the votes were youth, because we were really targeting schools. So when we provided the results in the report backs, we were able to do like a youth vote versus an adult vote, and then like the whole city of Peekskill voting results. And you can see how people voted, whether it was postal mail, website, or ballot box. And one of the most important ones, like Jason alluded to, that we were so impressed with, was the number of people who actually provided their contact information and wanted to learn more about how to stay active. And in both the towns, the majority of people actually checked the box and provided their emails and phone numbers. Okay, and so then we also just, we ranked the votes. So in the town of Phillipstown in 2017, the Community Congress vote of 755 people, These were the top 6 votes. And what I'll say is that these morphed into things over the years since this vote and this report was released. And all of these have seen action, except for number 3, which we'll get to on how things are moving forward in the town of Phillipstown, for example. Jay.
Just a quick point that what you see here, besides the ranking, you see a rank score, and that was compiled because we did really do a ranked score voting approach to the priorities, with top priorities being given more points, second priority less, to see how that affected the vote. And then the potential volunteers are the number of volunteers that gave their personal contact information tied to that priority. And that became important down the line because the groups of people who proposed, who wanted to keep working on that issue, now had a bank of volunteers to call upon in that transition. And the second note I'd make just before we get to impact is the reason why the Peekskill youth numbers were so high. And it was really interesting how people treated that. They were like, well, we want to know what the priorities are without the youth. And we're like, well, what is that saying? The reason they were so high is because we ended up forming a partnership with the city of Peekskill School District. And the Peekskill School District said, we'd like to make this part of our social studies curriculum, and we're going to run all of our classes through this process, which ended up leading to a lot of voting among students, which, ended up changing those proposals. And so you'll see jobs for youth was the #1 priority. And then I think once you stripped out the youth vote, a model walkable city became the #1 priority. And so, Josh, should we just go to impact? Because I know we want to. So I'll let people, read these. It's a quote by, I think, David, you asked a question about how you interact with elected bodies. So in both the town of Phillipstown and the city of Peekskill, not only was that report on the process distributed to the wider community, but there was a formal report given back to the elective bodies. And really, that was to say, as representatives, you should be working on the priorities that your constituents think are the most important. And here is a report back from this process that identifies top priorities. So you'll just see a quote from Richard Shea. I mean, I will say that there is a little bit of a tension of elected officials around this process when you're doing it, because they feel like this is their job. Their job is to set the agenda, right? But at the end of the process, for example, the supervisor in the town of Phillipstown thought that it was really important to have an outside body like this helping to identify what the kind of shared concerns are. And the second is a quote from a local land trust executive director who really used the community congress when clean water was a top priority to launch a whole new program for their land trust around clean water and protection of aquifers. And so just a few of the local impacts to note. Out of the town of Phillipstown, out of those top priority items, the town of Phillipstown created a position to coordinate responses to the opioid crisis. That later became a nonprofit called the Phillipstown Hub, which is a local working on mental health and drug overdose issues. The town of Phillipstown went on to create a new comprehensive plan update committee, which just published the 2030 Phillipstown Comprehensive Plan, which rolled in a lot of ideas. Like I mentioned, the local land trust launched a townwide clean water initiative. And then the Phillipstown Trails Committee to work on more biking and walking paths was one of the top priorities formed. And so we'll go on to the next slide. This is just, we can talk about if there's questions. The Phillipstown Trails Committee formed after the Phillipstown Community Congress by a group of those volunteers who want to work on the priorities. And they went through the long stakeholder process and most recently got a grant to conduct a feasibility study on building a multi-purpose biking and walking trail in the town of Phillipstown, which is the first step to a construction master plan. We can just go forward to the next slide. And so that process is in running. In Peekskill, I'd say one of the big impact stories is making Peekskill a model walkable city was one of the top priorities that came out of Peekskill. And so a new group has formed, which has become a nonprofit called Peekskill Walks, just focused on making Peekskill a more pedestrian-friendly town. If you go to the next slide, this is some of the work they've been doing since then. They advocated to the city to create a pedestrian plaza and block off a street that had been a one-way to create a pedestrian zone. They've gotten more crosswalks and crosswalks painted. They've become part of safe routes. And then if we look at the next slide, you know, that agenda and effort, kind of focused effort through this consensus process, allowed them to advocate successfully to local elected officials. The city council approved their create a public space proposal on Esther Street. And then later, Peekskill Walks was advocating as part of Peekskill's downtown revitalization initiative process to the state. They were one of the projects they advocated for at the state level, got a $1 million grant to improve connections for pedestrians and cyclists. So there is just a lot of power in the data creation around specific agenda items. And I think there's one more slide that talks about impact. And again, this gets at some of the questions asked in the chat. What ended up happening in Phillipstown, because the Phillipstown Community Congress kind of became known through the process as being nonpartisan, able to create these civic spaces where you could have intelligent conversations and a diversity of talks, we ended up actually being asked to host the only Putnam County Executive Candidates Forum that was held on the east side of Putnam County. And the way that gravitated is, instead of the county executive candidates coming and talking about their agenda items, they could only talk about how they would use the county executive seat to fulfill agenda items created through the community congress process. So it was a little bit thinking about how you flip kind of the power of agenda creation and how the representative has to talk about how they'll use their office to fulfill the agenda, as opposed to their, the agenda that they're proposing themselves. And I think, Jocelyn, does that take us through? Is that really, yeah, we wanted to end at 9:10. So we're a little, I told you the caffeine slowly began to tick up as we talked. But we really wanted, because we know a lot of folks on this call in their own right are kind of powerhouses in their community. And we also know that a lot of these initiatives really can get going just by 3 or 4 civically minded people. So we want to make sure there's enough time for questions and answers and kind of us thinking. But we're really happy to share some of that experience with you briefly, and we're incredibly happy that Partners for Climate Action and Funding Futures is kind of bringing it to more communities and seeing how it evolves from there.
Thank you both so much. Jocelyn, were you going to say something else?
No, thank you.
Okay.
I was just saying thanks.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
It's just, thank you so much for sharing that with us. It's just so remarkable what you've done and what's come of it. And just this idea at the base of it that we vote every 4 years or every 2 years in smaller towns, but that you had a vision for how to help people do something. People want to do something in between. It feels not enough, obviously, but you had a vision for how to help them do that. And it's really amazing. And I want to get into the inspiration and what was behind your thought to do this. But first, I just want to ask a qualitative question. Are there ways that you have seen, I mean, you just showed us all of the actions, I think so much in large part to your rigor of how you ran this process, but what came of it? I guess I want to just ask, though, are there ways that you've seen or felt your community change since the Community Congress process qualitatively, in addition to the actions? Like, how does your community feel? What are people saying to each other? Are more people knowing each other? Any anecdotes you could share about what has changed and what you've been satisfied to see?
Jay, you want to go?
I'm sure, or you can go. Oh, yeah. I mean, I would just say that one thing to balance is that after you've created the agenda, there's the part about doing the work. And I saw someone brought up, I think it was Jem, about some of those initiatives take a long time. And so I think what changed is that it really just created a way to suck people into initiatives they cared about. And then a lot of those people, like people on the Phillipstown Trails Committee, are still working at that goal. You know, people, some of them gravitated over to initiatives that were housed in nonprofits, and that was kind of, in some ways, you're able to keep the momentum going because you have some sort of institutional support, while others were really just loose groups of community volunteers. But I would say that, you know, there is a hunger for this, and people are already talking right now about doing the next Phillipstown Community Congress. We resisted that when people talked about it 2 years later, because we didn't want it to just become an agenda creating process. We want there to be an action element. But I think every community has to decide, you know, what does this thing look like if you institutionalize it, you know, into the way their local government works? What does that look like? But I do think it helped create spaces where people can talk about things civically with some parameters that don't go off the rails, you know, right away.
Yeah, great. I also love the fact that you are seeing this, and certainly for Funding Futures, we do as well, as something that's helpful for municipal leaders and also helps hold them accountable. So I'm just curious, like at the base of this is this idea of participatory democracy. And you mentioned at the beginning, Jason, that you had witnessed or been a part of some other participatory democracy processes in New York City and somewhere else. I'm just wondering if you can share what those experiences were and what struck you about them if they were new to you.
Well, I would just say, like, I had just been witness, probably like other people, to little elements of participatory democracy happening in real life. I mean, I had always been interested in it philosophically, but I didn't know about kind of the New York City participatory budgeting, where, you know, at the neighborhood level, they allow community boards to prioritize funding for the neighborhood, and then the funding follows those priorities. I mean, I love theory, but it's really great that money follows those ideas. So those were, you know, those were always kind of very inspiring. And then Paige, the only last thing I'd say is, when we do a presentation like this, it feels so thought out. Like, looking backwards, it feels so thought out. I would just reiterate to everybody how, like, thoroughly remarkable it was, in the sense that there was a basic open-ended question. You found a core group of volunteers who were committed to this idea of building a platform, and you agreed to organize events to bring people together. I just say, like, there's a lot here. I don't want anybody to look back and be like, wow, this seems like, you know, and I saw someone ask a question about this. I mean, it made it easier that as we went through the Phillipstown Community Congress process, a local donor said, how much would it take to do this across the whole town? And we said 10,000, not really knowing. And then we kind of were able to pay for the direct mailing and really all of the outreach. And then for the Peekskill Community Congress, we went in and got a separate grant for that. But I do think that's why Funding Futures is so important, because you're putting that institutional backing into the process, which is really important.
That's great. So I'll ask just a couple more questions. I know people, please put your questions in the chat. But let's see, were there any projects that you saw wanting to happen and there was volunteer enthusiasm, but then it wasn't able to happen for the reasons of funding?
Jocelyn, you want to take that, or should I?
I don't know if I wouldn't say necessarily funding. Oh, I mean, perhaps say, for example, that third priority in Phillipstown was a teen center that had to partially be related to funding. And I know the walking and biking trails is also funding based, because they would become in their own right, you know, their own organizations or projects that would require maybe infrastructure, or paying rent or paying staff. So I think that is that's a possibility, but that's also maybe a bigger problem than all of this anyway, because I mean, there's something exciting about maybe building infrastructure, right? That of course is beyond a community Congress process. I think that probably the biggest barrier, another barrier to getting some of the priorities really off the ground is institutions themselves. It's, you know, not everyone is behind the ideas, in spite of maybe the community having some interest in it. And if you don't have that committed sense of the volunteers to really push an institution in a direction. So for example, in Phillipstown, it was about consolidation of our school districts. That's still not happened, and it comes up quite often, but it's really hard to get these two, rooted institutions to do quite a difficult process, to be honest. It would cost them money, for example, to consolidate. So, I mean, unfortunately, money's at the bottom of a lot of it, but I think the flip side of it is that there's so much that can get done through a small group of volunteers, and small amounts of funding that that can really propel a little bit more action. That is kind of more, the feeling that we felt.
Makes sense.
I'm just add one thing to that, which is
Yeah.
just as groups think about doing this, one thing that was an organizing principle for both of these efforts is the locus of control local?
Yeah.
So it wasn't an effort to advocate to a higher geographic level. It's like, can you achieve this locally? And so it does become important to know who has to take the action to achieve the priority. Is it the local planning board, school board? Is it just a group of volunteers working in a civic space? That all becomes very important kind of to that question as well, Paige.
Yeah, great. And I appreciate what you're saying about, the will of the people basically helping projects to happen that might not otherwise, in addition to the funding piece. So some questions from the audience. Wondering your thoughts on how to maintain participation, engagement, and belief in this level of civic engagement when, for example, it takes 7 years, if I read it right, for the new bike lane infrastructure to move from forum to planning, the time it sometimes takes for change to be implemented, not to mention agenda items voted on that are never implemented by government. So, right, how do you keep the momentum going, or how did you see others do that?
I'll just start very quickly. I mean, momentum kept going when you actually formed some kind of group that, I mean, literally would meet monthly and move things forward, on some of the top priorities. For example, the climate smart work in Phillipstown, or the Peekskill walks work in Peekskill. And in the case of Phillipstown, getting some of the priorities into comprehensive planning or on agendas of the local municipalities, was able to keep it at least in the public eye, so momentum could maybe be reignited. But you're making a good point with this question that some of the priorities take time, and you have to be in it for the long haul, so to say. And so you need to work with, I mean, this is, I think, goes back to the beginning of the whole process, which is how do you build a diverse group of interested participants in this who represent a lot of different stakeholders in the community, because if they're represented and can stay in contact with each other, it's more likely to maintain a little bit of the momentum, but without a doubt, things drop off. And I mean, we haven't done it, but NJ, I'll give you in one sec, but I wonder if, isn't it time for Phillipstown Community Congress to, to just kind of reignite or kind of take it to the next level to get some of those, the action back on people's agendas? Jason?
And I just think this question is a really good one because it points out something we didn't do well, right? That a lesson learned is we didn't do the follow-up communication about how different initiatives were making progress well enough. And maybe that's because we went on to other initiatives, but I would think that keeping contact with the other initiatives and providing a quarterly or an annual update to describe what had happened on the impact level would be a really important thing to do that we didn't do. So those future efforts, I think that is very helpful to kind of keep that community together of people working for that proactive change.
That is such a good point, and it's related to what some other folks have written in the chat. I mean, we did one update, for example, to the city of, well, we've gone to the town halls, but like updates to the community, for example, in Peekskill once and Phillipstown once, and so we can share any of the materials we have. A lot of it is up on the Peekskill Community Congress website, but also we are happy to, to send all of the content that we use, whether it was flyers, whether it was emails. I can send that that first update progress report that then we never did again, on how the initiatives were going. But I'm happy to share what we did, because I think, for example, when you saw our Phillipstown Community Congress flyer, there's a much room for improvement, like Jason is mentioning. So if you kind of just see what we had done and then want to improve upon it and adjust it to what your community reflects and needs, Highly recommend it. But yeah, we're happy to share whatever folks might be interested in learning more about.
Great. And we are going to share, a follow-up email with all of those materials after this morning coffee. Thank you. And to that, someone else asked, they said, I love this and your work is amazing. Are there any learn from us advice? Is there any learn from us advice that you would give as don't do's? So, in addition to what you've already shared.
I mean, I'm just gonna, I'm gonna kind of go off some of the questions asked. So someone asked in terms of learned of, these last two questions get at blowback from existing municipal leaders and conflict. I think it's really important because remember, one of these goals is not only to inspire civic action, is to gain community power by identifying support for a limited number of things. I mean, any town board or elected board has lots of things coming at them, right? The agenda kind of gets created by the emergency of the moment. And so having an agenda with a process behind is important. So in answer to that question, in terms of things you should do, you should go to, if priorities are going to involve local decision-making bodies, I'd go to those decision-making bodies early in the process and make them aware that what the community group is doing is trying to discover what the community feels the most strongly about in terms of local actions. And all of this work is things that should be in support of the work the town board is supposed to do. I guess what I'm saying is try to make it a support to their work instead of an adversarial dynamic. And I think one way to do that is to go to them early and explain what the process is and why it's being undertaken.
That's great. And Jason, you have a unique perspective, I think, because now I think since this process since the community Congress process that you catalyzed, you have become a local official, I believe, right? When did you become elected to the town board? What year was that?
2020, I got appointed and then ran, I think, in 2020.
Great. And so do you have any perspective you'd like to share about being on both sides? So first you did this as a citizen and now you're an elected official, and maybe how you've seen it make your work easier or enhance the work of the board now that you're on it.
Yeah, I mean, I got two quick things. One, I'm disappointed in myself for not being able to integrate more direct democracy into the workings of the town board. Right. And two, I think that's because I didn't really fully grasp as a first time elected official how culturally different town board meetings are. And that being said, like, as many of you know, go to town board meetings, there's no there. There's no one there really. Except for kind of hot button issues, so as opposed to community Congress with food and interest and civic engagement where there's 150 people, in a town board, you're in an empty room. And so I think there's that feeling of like, well, wow, that cultural impediment of what civic kind of life has become when it's ingrained within an elected official body, even how a lot of elected officials kind of have a weird anti-democratic leaning in terms of like public comment coming at the end of sessions instead of the front. So I guess I'd say that, like, don't underestimate the calcified culture of elected bodies. And two, we need to work better at institutionalizing ways for people to be involved in local elected bodies more so. And I think that's a long-term effort.
That's great. Well, that seems like a great note to end on. Thank you both so much for bringing this to our audience, our network. And, just really grateful for the work that you're doing. And obviously, it's really inspired PCA and myself personally. So Jason will return as a guest speaker for a special session for our Funding Futures program, which we will be opening to the public. So mark your calendars for August 6th, when Jason will talk about community-owned solar. And this will take place from 1 to 2:30. We'll be sending out an invitation for that to all of you. At that session, Jason will tell us why municipally owned and community owned solar could be an important tool for providing clean electricity, but also creating a financial asset. He'll present what his new nonprofit venture, Municipal Solar Partners, offers to towns. Stay tuned for a coming announcement about our next Morning Coffee series soon, which will take place in September. And as I said, we will follow up with Jason Jocelyn's work, links, and along with a copy of today's recording. So thank you so much, Jason and Jocelyn, and thank you everyone for coming.